So there was a time when flagship phones did not cost upwards of $1,000. However, in today's day and age, it's becoming more and more normal. But high-end phones are not the only option for consumers. Companies like OnePlus and Motorola have been making premium devices without charging a premium. So what does $300 buy you compared to the $1,000 or more you could spend on a flagship device? Hey everyone, this is Luke with Android Police, and today we'll be talking about the Motorola G7. Now, with any product, the specs on paper can usually point to how well the device will perform, and in the Motorola G7's case, this is definitely true. The G7 ships with 4GB of RAM, a 6.2-inch 1080p display, 64GB of internal storage plus a microSD card slot, a 3000 mAh battery, rear dual cameras with 12 megapixels and 5 megapixels respectively, and lastly a Qualcomm Snapdragon 632 processor. But as interesting as all these specs are, sometimes they don't translate into everyday use. First, let's touch on performance. Most people would assume that with a lower price point, you would be sacrificing at least some speed for the lower cost. However, in day-to-day use, the G7 was surprisingly quick, handling everything that I threw at it. Multitasking was responsive and there was little to no stuttering when running multiple applications. Often in budget-priced handsets, you will start to see a significant performance drop when running multiple apps at the same time, but the Snapdragon 632 with 4GB of RAM handled everything like a champ. Now, as good as performance is, it doesn't really matter if the battery life is terrible. Fortunately, the Motorola G7 excels here. The 3000 mAh battery gets you through a full day and then some. Now, in my testing, I averaged about 6 to 8 hours of on-screen time, and without using it on standby, it lasted for about 3 to 4 days. Now, obviously, if you are taxing the system with intensive applications and games, your battery life is going to vary. But if you're just going through your day-to-day, then the Motorola G7 will hold up just fine. Also, what's really awesome about the G7 is the turbocharging technology. Shipping with a 15-watt fast charger, I was able to get up to about 75% in just over 45 minutes. The footprint of the Moto G7 is actually quite good when you consider that you're getting a massive 6.2-inch display. In fact, the phone isn't much bigger than my iPhone 8 Plus, which has a 5.5-inch screen. Now, because of the technological limitations of an LCD, the Motorola G7 doesn't quite have an edge-to-edge display, however, it's pretty close. The rounded corners are a nice touch and the teardrop design is actually a lot more pleasing to look at than you would think. Coupled with this, the physical display is actually pretty good. It has decent colors and it's tack sharp, coming in at a resolution of 2270 by 1080 and a PPI of 403. There is a slight blue cast to the overall feel of the display, but if this really bothers you, you can always use a third-party application to fix this. For me, it wasn't an issue at all. Moving on to the camera, this is probably where the G7 lacks the most. Like I mentioned before, the G7 ships with dual rear-facing cameras coming in at 12 megapixels and 5 megapixels respectively. However, the 5 megapixel rear camera is only used as a depth sensor and not a true second camera. In addition to this, there is a 5 megapixel front-facing shooter, and while on paper these seem decent for a smartphone camera, the results were underwhelming. This isn't to say that the camera was bad, on the contrary, it's very usable. However, I just felt pictures were a bit whitewashed. Colors were oversaturated, and while the interface of the camera is pretty straightforward, the produced images lack dynamic range and sharpness. The 5 megapixel depth camera does fairly well for a mid-range smartphone, but often it would miss focus and end up blurring unwanted edges. Additionally, the camera does have several features such as AR mode and Google Lens, which are cool, but only fun at best. You can get some slightly better results if you sideload the Google Camera APK, however, for the average everyday consumer, what you get in the stock app will work just fine. In terms of gaming, the Moto G7 handles itself just fine. While the Snapdragon 632 isn't the fastest on the market, it was able to run pretty much everything I threw at it. Sure, there were a couple of instances where I had some lag in intensive games like Asphalt 9, but everything else was as smooth as butter. In the same vein, watching media such as Netflix or YouTube is quite nice on the large 18:9 aspect ratio. Now, the single speaker on the Moto G7 isn't very good, but at this low price point, you can't expect much. The G7 ships with stock Android 9 Pie with a couple of features added by Motorola. These include Moto Actions, Moto Display, and Moto Voice. The latest update adds a few things like Google Pixel's call screening. Now, even though the G7 is still a budget handset, it's still a pleasant surprise to see stock Android running with little to no bloatware. However, one thing missing in the G7 is NFC, which unfortunately means Google Pay is a no-go. Something that is often overlooked is call quality, which is quite ironic given that we're still talking about a phone. In the Moto G7's case, the call quality is decent. Nothing quite stood out to me as amazing, but it does work, and for making calls, it performs fine. Lastly, let's talk about the price. So the G7 retails for $299, and for a handset this good, I'd say this is a pretty solid price point. Now, you aren't going to get an amazing camera or sound quality, but if you want a well-rounded budget smartphone, the Motorola G7 fits the bill. So the G7 seems to check off most of the major boxes. Good performance, great price, sleek design, and great battery life. However, there are a few drawbacks. The camera isn't amazing, the sound quality could definitely be improved, and the glass design of the phone attracts a ton of fingerprints. Also, the lack of NFC and Motorola's notorious reputation for slow and relatively few software updates on the G series may leave you looking towards other options. However, apart from these, there really isn't any other significant cons. So if you need a budget phone with decent performance and good fundamentals, then the Motorola G7 will do just fine. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and consider supporting the channel by subscribing to Android Police. If you'd like to see some of my own content, feel free to check out my channel, but for now, I'll catch you in the next video.